Okay, so again, today we are going to look at how we can implement kind of a final mesh into this kind of process. So assuming you are making a vehicle-based game and you've created the functionality like I have now, and now you're ready to go ahead and import your custom mesh, the mesh that fits, the style and theme of your game. We're going to kind of go through that process now. So if I go in here, I open up Maya, you can see I've got a truck here that was created, okay? And the big thing I'm going to go ahead and point out some of the obvious things you need to do basically before you export it. So I made this awesome truck, and I'm ready to take it into Unreal Engine 4 and start having it cruise around. I want to point out something that I know I mentioned to many of you guys when we were back in Digital 3D Foundations, but in case you forgot or maybe you had a different instructor from me, this pivot point here, the pivot point that comes right here on Maya, is not the pivot point that will be assigned inside of Unreal Engine 4. Your pivot point from Maya to Unreal Engine 4 is determined by the origin. So this is the origin right here. If your grid's visible, 0, 0, 0 in the world inside of Maya is always where your pivot point's going to be. Okay, so even though if I click this object, it has a pivot point right here, or bring it into Maya, its pivot point will actually be right there. Okay, so before you do anything else, you do want to make sure that wherever you want the pivot point to be for your mesh, or any mesh you're going to bring in Unreal Engine 4, you want to make sure that wherever you want that to be, you need to reposition your object relative to the origin to get it there. Okay. If you just want pretty much the center of your object, probably the easiest thing to do is just to click on your object, go to Modify Center Pivot, and that'll put the pivot point right in the center of whatever object you have. Okay. Now that you've done that, if you hold X on your keyboard, you're going to see that my snaps come on. You can see it right there, and it's right here. Again, up here on the window, you can see. Remember, if I'm holding X, it actually is turning on this grid, or you can just turn it on here, either way. But I'm going to hold X, and I'm going to click and drag this over until it snaps into the center. I can't quite see it because my mesh is there, so I'm going to go ahead and switch to a wireframe view. And I'm just going to make sure, again, that I'm getting it right on the center. If right now I'm having a little weirdness with the camera angle, if you ever get like that, just hit F, and it'll reframe on your object. Okay. So again, I'm just holding X, which is giving me that grid snap, and I'm going to snap it right there to the origin. Okay. Now, if I took this into Unreal Engine 4, my pivot point would be right in the center of the object, and that would be fine. But the way our box is oriented, it might be a little bit better actually if it was kind of centered on the bottom. So what I'm actually going to do is switch to a side view, or a front view, I guess. I'm just going to lift this until basically the bottom of my object lines up with that 0, 0, 0. And so basically what I'm saying is I want my pivot point to be right here in the center of this object, kind of in the middle area here. Okay. The most important thing really is to just make sure you know where you want it to be. Oftentimes, it's really annoying, but I'll see games or especially from students, where they'll have an object that's actually over here, and their pivot point will be in this area, and it's just really awkward to move it around in the world. Okay. Okay, so we've got our object set up here. It's pretty. We have set up the pivot point, so it's going to be a good location. I'm going to go ahead and go into the material editor and make sure that any materials I have applied to it have a unique name. So right now I have Lambert 1. I can't rename Lambert 1, so I'm going to go ahead and create a new Lambert. And I'm just going to call it my truck body material. Okay. And then I'll just assign that to my truck. And I can't add color to it if I want. I mean, I can come in here and make it, some sort of color if I really want to. Just I clicked the wrong one. I'll just go at least to kind of a darker. I'll do kind of a charcoal color. There we go. Okay, cool. Okay. And so again, the main thing is, so steps you want to do, you want to make sure that your pivot point's in the right place. You want to make sure that you have a material with a custom name applied. And then when you're kind of at this point, you are ready to go ahead and export it to an FBX file format. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and select this object, and I'm going to go ahead and go to File, Export Selection, go into the Settings option here, and I'll just expand this down, and I'll go ahead and hit Export Selection again. And once I do that, I'll get a few more options. So I'm going to go ahead and give it a name. I'm just going to put it on my desktop, and I'm going to go ahead and call it truckbody.fbx. And then over here on the right side, this is some things you kind of want to pay attention to. So first of all, I'm just going to kind of scroll down here, and under geometry, I want to make sure I include my smoothing groups. Okay. If you don't include your smoothing groups, I can show you here in a second what that will look like. If you don't include your smoothing groups, you will not be able to choose whether or not your mesh is hardened and softened. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a second. We're not exporting any animation, so I'll make sure that animation is unchecked. We're not exporting any cameras or lights, so I can make sure both of those are unchecked. And that's really it. Just make sure smoothing groups is turned on. Put in a name, and then hit Export Selection. Just hit on what smoothing groups are. Without smoothing groups, this is what your piece will look like. Okay, it'll look faceted. You see how now I'm getting like it's all faceted. I'm seeing those highlight. You know, it's hard edges on everything. That's what yours will look like if you don't have smoothing groups turned on. And this goes back to what we talked about back in Digital 3D Foundations. If you go under Mesh Display, you have these options to do harden edge, soften edge, or just kind of auto calculate it. And again, right now you can see we have hard edges for some of these areas, like for example here. This color doesn't really show color very well, so I'm going to go ahead and turn this back up to kind of the default. Okay, so you can see how we have this hard edge here. You can see the shading goes right up this edge and then stops. If I were to select this edge, I'll just do these two and go Mesh Display, Soften. It would try to round that out. You see how it's trying to make it look soft there instead of hard. And there are times when you want it to look that way, but oftentimes you're going to need that to go ahead and be a hard. So just a quick review from kind of some things we covered. Okay, we've now exported our model. We're clicking here into Maya, and we're ready to go ahead and bring that model in. We'll go ahead and go to my assets folder, and we're just going to go ahead and import file. And then I stored mine on my desktop. So I'm just going to grab that truckbody FBX. I'll just say yes to all. And I brought in my truckbody. I can drag it in the world if I'm curious what it looks like. So you can kind of see what my object looks like. Okay. So I'm going to hop into my player vehicle now. And this is, again, I'm going to show you how I would approach this project. You can approach it differently. But my suggestion to you is not to use your actual your pretty mesh as your base physics model. My suggestion is you just have your pretty mesh follow your static mesh that you've already laid down. So I'm going to leave that static mesh there. So I'm going to click on it, and I'm going to add another static mesh component. And you see, well, kind of jump to it to kind of guess what I wanted it to do. But basically, normally it'll probably come in without the mesh already applied. I don't know why it's automatically jumped into that, but anyway. But normally it'll come in without this load like that. And you'll have to go into truckbody and then add your custom static mesh on the right. And this is a child of the static mesh, so it will follow it around. Now, my suggestion to you is with truckbody, just call it pretty mesh, or something similar. So this is basically, we're going to use this purely as a beautiful, it's supposed to be pretty. We're not going to use it for collision or anything. So the first thing we're going to do is select this and then turn off collision. We're just going to say no collision. go ahead and see how it looks like so far. Oops. Apparently it's not the child right now, so we're going to fix that. So go ahead and make sure that I drag this up and that it is the child.
Hey, Dustin, we
Yeah.
can't hear.
Okay. Let me see here. Okay, so we're back to it, and we have it all pulled in, and it should now follow. So if you can see, the truck is now following, the truck body is now following our piece, but there's probably going to need to be some customizing. It doesn't actually look terrible from the back, but as soon as we rotate this to the side, we're probably going to see that this doesn't line up quite right. Correct, yes. Mark, that is absolutely correct. At first it didn't work because it wasn't a child, so we adjusted, we made sure it was parented, and it worked fine after that. Okay, so let's do a few things first. Let's go ahead and first, let's just hide the static mesh. I'm going to click on the static mesh. This is going to be the main component that has physics on it. We're just going to go ahead and do hidden, I don't know if I can do hidden thing. No, it's hidden indicator. Now I can really just look at just the truck body and see what's lining up and what's not. So just come back a little bit. I might just get a right view like this. It might get easier just to see. And I'll select that body, kind of move it into place. Some of this might be kind of trial and error a little bit. That looks closer. We're going to be going the wrong way. Okay. So, and this is partially preference. If you feel like you want your vehicle to look like it has a high suspension, you can keep it higher like this. Or if you want to do more of a low rider, you can actually physically lower the car. Just to realize if you lower it too much, there's really times where the wheel might accidentally intersect the vehicle. So here's a lower one, as you can see off those big jumps. Sometimes it actually does intersect the body a little bit. Truthfully, it's probably not going to be a big deal if it does intersect it slightly a little bit. People aren't going to be able to see it in most cases. But you just have to customize it for the overall feel you want, and then just make sure that it's not overlapping so much that it's distracting. You obviously don't want that sort of visual thing to be affecting how it looks visually. I mean, you don't want the visual part to distract from the game. But again, this is probably about as low as I would go, but it feels more like a kind of a lower suspension truck you might see on the road. Honestly, it's probably even a little bit lower. I don't know. It's not too bad. Anyway, but again, all the physics and everything is being applied to that base box we created. Now we're just bringing in the pretty part to make it work. Um, the box was originally sized to match this mesh, so that's why it fits together so well. You may obviously have to readjust the placement of your axles. You may have to go in here to your axles, like this one here, and actually readjust it if it's not, going into the right place. So again, there's some things that may be necessary for some of you guys, depending on if you model your new model. If you choose to model around that box that gave you, if you model around the box that gave you, it's going to be real easy. You can just plug it in. If not, you just have to kind of make some tweaks to the placement of your axles in the focus, basically. But I mean, just kind of in a nutshell, this is kind of quick and dirty, but you can see you get pretty good results pretty fast just by doing, this. And so, again, as soon as I'm satisfied, I can go ahead and bring this back. to a 0. And even if there's a little bit of overlap, you're probably not going to notice it from this angle. Okay? And again, this is definitely, you saw that was kind of rocking like that. That's a perfect example where if it just feels like it's driving crazy, you may need to adjust your damping levels a little bit. That just seems a little bit over the top, so I may want to go into my static mesh and adjust my angular damping so that just, well, I'm at 1.5, I don't want to go too much higher, but maybe let's try to. Angular damping is going to keep me from rocking like that so much. There we go. That's not too bad. I think that maybe is a little bit smoother. So again, adjusting those damping can actually be can be maybe what you need basically. Anyway, so yeah, that is how you need. That's the steps you need to take to import your custom methods you guys are building for your vehicles. You can use your custom vehicle and replace the static mesh like this, like actually replace the box instead of just adding it as a child. But I don't recommend it. It's up to you. And if Kristen had a question on it, how do you know how big the vehicle needs to be to import it? How do you know how big the vehicle needs to be? Well, I guess when you're talking about overall scale, and I'm not sure if this will answer your question, but you can tell me if it doesn't. Um, I would encourage you to work at a pseudo real world scale. It doesn't have to be perfect. Oh, so when I actually did this, technically I already had this truck first, and I actually created the box in here and just basically sized it off of the size of this vehicle. So that made it easier. But the other way of doing it would be for you guys to import the box that I gave you back into Maya. But yeah, you can basically, what you might want to, if you're talking about the easiest way possible, my suggestion to you is import that box back into Maya and then model your car around that box. Like using that as kind of a guide for how big it should be. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, but if you start with that box that I gave you guys, it's going to be a lot easier basically to make adjustments. This should be a reminder for all of you guys, but 1 unit inside of Maya equals 1 centimeter inside of Unreal Engine 4. So to give you an idea, this object is this box is basically 155 centimeters tall, and if I go into like let's say Google real quick, 155 centimeters to feet is approximately 5 feet tall. Okay, so that's probably about right. So basically, again, you got to keep in mind the truck body without the wheels. So if you put the truck flat on the ground and went from the bottom of the ground to the top, it would be about 5 feet tall. So keep in mind that try to keep pseudo realism scale. That's probably pretty accurate. When I was actually building this mesh, I got real world dimensions for its truck, so I knew I was on the right track. I don't care if it's accurate to a centimeter, but I would make sure that you're building at a scale that is at least realistic to the real world proportions. Because the physics, all the physics in Unreal Engine 4 are built around real world by default. The steps work more like real world physics. So if you're working at micro scales, it really throws off all your physics. Again, like I said, and you can change the static mesh. The biggest thing is if you use this static mesh, will behave completely different. Going back to this, the shape of the static mesh has a huge impact on how it like steers and stuff. So if you basically this box will behave much differently than that custom mesh. So one advantage to again just using the same base model for everything is that all of them at the simplest level will handle exactly the same. So I could have this, if I could use this base net model, I could bring in, have one of these be a truck body, one be a minivan body, one be a Jeep, and all of these, and at the simplest level, they would all behave very similarly. if he's going to make it easier. So like the truck obviously is probably going to be faster than the minivan, and uh, so I would just increase its max, its max speed. And on the other hand, I mean maybe the minivan's not the best example, but I mean you know what I'm saying. I can just they start in the same place. It's easier customizing to get their experience. Anyway, is there any general questions before we move on to the next topic of the day about kind of importing your custom meshes for your vehicle?